Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. You are listening to This Wholistic Life with your host, Nicholas Zart, and this is a Tap the Source production. Now, this is the very first episode, so I'll introduce myself a little bit, and I'll introduce what we will talk about. But suffice it to say, my name is Nicholas, and my last name is Zart. And if you hear a little accent, that's because I was born in another country, so English is my second language, so please have mercy. I do have a sense of humor, thankfully. The past 10 years, I've spent it covering the world of electric vehicles and, of course, renewable energy, the smart grid, so on and so forth. But what this did was that it launched me on a path of convergence of trends and what was happening. But also what interests me the most, and something I've never done professionally, but I hope to do it professionally, what is happening with our society and what is happening more specifically with us human beings. So when I was 13, actually when I was 11, I had to leave, my parents left the south of France, Nice, where I grew up, to come to New York and very close to New York City. And at the age of 13, I all of a sudden had this spiritual longing, this spiritual craving, and I went out and I started looking for answers. Now, at the time, this was about 1977, maybe 1979. The only thing available at the time was, of course, Christian churches. So I went to Christian churches. Most of them were Protestants. And I didn't really get the answers I was looking for. I was an eager person. I wanted to find out what was going on. There was this longing inside of me, and I was looking. Unfortunately, Christianity's message, especially at the time, was be quiet, have faith. And that was it. But it never really answered my questions, and so that was deeply troubling. I turned to, Jewish temples, but not being Jewish, that was a bit of a problem. And when I found out what it took just to become Jewish, I thought, wow, that's kind of tough. And plus, I'll never really be fully Jewish, too. So another thing that I did after that is I was very lucky to have been introduced to an Eastern philosophy class. I was in a very special program in high school that was called School Within a School, if you want to check it out on Mamaroneck High School. And what this was that it was a special system for kids who didn't really fit in the normal system, kids who just didn't excel, kids who were bored in the normal system. And so we were lucky in the sense that we had evaluations written about us, and we would in turn write evaluations about how we performed in the class. And this is how I made it through high school. Never saw a chair, never saw a desk. We sat on sofas, basically. Our teachers had long hair. It was kind of like the remnants of the 60s. But it was amazing because it fostered a sort of a more mature approach to what we were supposed to do, and also how to get us to evolve and not just follow what we were being taught. So one of the first questions my counselor asked me after making sure I took the requisites such as English, math, and I believe history at the time was, what do you want to study? And I didn't really understand what he meant by that. And he said, well, here's a catalog of all the classes that we had. And in it, I saw Eastern philosophies, and I thought, wow, that's exactly it. So I took my Eastern philosophy class. And one of the first things that that I was introduced to was Taoism, the Chinese philosophy system. And after that, we were introduced to Buddhism. And all of this gave me an insight as to how the East viewed philosophy and religion too. So that really set the tone for at least the few next decades of my life. And not to say that I went out and I partied and I had a great time after that. So I was not the most spiritual person for the longest time. But a lot of it did cement my foundation. I understood there was a little bit more to life than just that. I couldn't be a full-fledged atheist, because it just seems like it's a little too crazy, right? I don't see how I can just be born out of nowhere and then die out of nowhere like this. I mean, it just seems a little empty and not well thought out. The idea of coming back into on this planet through many lifestyle and eventually eventually growing up and understanding things made more sense to me. Well, when you don't really know what's going on and you have to kind of make a choice, you go with your gut feeling. At least I know I did. My gut feeling was that there's a spiritual dimension to life, and that's how I started leading it in 1977, 1979. So I followed pretty much all of the regular things that happen in a young man's life, and I meditated as much as I could. I had direct talks, or if you want, prayers, I guess, although at the time I didn't want to call it prayers. It was bad. But throughout my last 3 decades of growing up, and now actually I should say more 4 decades, I'm 50 now, I was very fortunate to pick and choose lots of different things from lots of different philosophies, religions, and other systems that help us, or at least give us an insight as to what is happening. Hence the idea for today's show, and it's called This Wholistic Life. Now, you probably have noticed that I spell holistic with a W because, well, it's the whole. I'm really talking about here the whole, not just the holy aspect of a holistic life, because, well, a holistic life with a W really can incorporate the holy, the saintly, but it will also incorporate everything, and that means philosophy, religion, and any other kind of spiritual topics that you want to put into it. So the whole fundamental is, how do we build today, in 2016, a spiritual life, a holistic life? And we're very fortunate because 100 years ago, you probably couldn't do most of anything that we were doing now. Now, there was a great rebirth right about 100 years ago where the New Age, quote unquote, it was called the New Age, came about, and it started reintroducing to a Western society that was quickly going into a very material way of thinking, and in a very material world, it reintroduced the whole esoteric aspect, the spiritual aspect. But it was the beginning, and also, I don't think society was nearly as mature yet to adopt it. However, having said this, there were some pretty amazing groups that did a lot of research, and that went very, very far. It was also the rebirth of the Rosicrucians, also the rebirth of, to a certain extent, of other groups, as you know, such as the Freemasons, obviously, and all of this sort of tapered down after 1933. You know, when we started seeing the beginning of the rise of World War II, the huge economic downturn in the U.S., and after that. Well, after World War II, things changed a heck of a lot. So today, in 2016, we can talk about these things pretty openly. But think about it. 10, 20 years ago, it wasn't so. I mean, you know, at a party, under certain circumstances, with certain people, you could kind of talk about your little private hidden garden. But today, we're very lucky because with almost anybody you meet, you can talk about these things. You can talk about religion, and not in the sense of I go to church every Sunday morning, but yet I get drunk on Saturday night kind of thing, but more in a real esoteric way, in a more spiritual way, in a more meaningful way. And case in point, pretty much almost any city now has a yoga studio or yoga center. Almost everybody has heard of yoga. Grant you, a lot of yoga right now is more joint stretching than anything. It's still an opening. And it doesn't just stop here. Most people have heard of Buddhism. I've met some amazing American Buddhists who are so open, so even-keeled and deeply centered in themselves, and it's quite amazing. So throughout the show, we'll also discuss the different systems and the different philosophies that you have available to yourself, and to help you to better understand not only who you are, but how you are, and also, hopefully and ideally, what you're supposed to do here on this planet. And guess what? That happens to be my favorite topic because at 50, I'm still trying to figure it out, and I'm barely starting to get a little tiny glimpse of it. And in my case, it was very simple. I had to just listen to my little subconscious, my, as we call it now, inner child, or as the Hawaiian call it, my unihipili. So we'll talk about, obviously, Buddhism. Buddhism has been a huge influence in our society, especially in our Western society, and it has transformed a lot of people. Now, there's obviously a vulgarization of Buddhism, and we'll talk about that, because Buddhism is much, much more than that. Heck, in fact, There is Indian Buddhism, there is Tibetan Buddhism, there is Thai Buddhism, there's all different types of Buddhism, even Japanese Buddhism, and they're all slightly different. Of course, on top of that, you can add Zen, which is basically the Chinese Chen, but viewed by the by the Japanese. So, in and of these systems, you will find a myriad of different interpretations and different systems, which will help you find what fits best for you. But here's my little word of advice. Don't take it too seriously. Don't take it too personally. And if you can, don't dive too deeply into it, because things adapt, things change. Buddhism changes, everything changes. This is the one constant about life in this universe, this observable universe, is that nothing rests. Everything changes. So don't take it too hardly on yourself. Don't be too hard on yourself because you don't understand this or you can't meditate every day for 20 minutes. Sometimes there's a reason. Sometimes it's just that it's not the right time, or it's not the right moment in your life, or you have something else to do, or simply enough, you just haven't found the right type of meditation or the right system that makes you go, I really want to do it. And I'll tell you one thing. Although I've been studying esoteric practices for a very long time, decades now, it's only now at 50 that I'm comfortable with one of them, to the point where I have to do it every day to the tune of an hour to sometimes an hour and a half, and it feels good. And it's not something that I can rationalize, it's just something that is. So another thing we'll talk about too is we'll talk about the big poles of influences that we still have on this planet. And in my very simplistic mind, I put them as, the Tibetan Indian poles, where a lot of history, ancient culture, civilization, and philosophies history resides. The other pole is, of course, Egypt, because that encompasses most of the Mediterranean, which, by the way, is very, very rich in history. And we'll also look at Central South America, specifically between Guatemala and Mexico, where you had, obviously, the Aztec and the Mayans. This is the third huge important pole. Within each of these poles, there are also satellites, and some of them are some of them are amazing, and most people might not really know that much about them. I'm thinking, obviously, here in the United States, our Native Americans, the original Indians, if you wish, have some amazing philosophies, and after a while, when you start to learn about these philosophical systems, you realize that they kind of have one thing in common, one or two or three things in common most of the time, but there are parallels. One of my favorite system, and this is one that sticks with me, might not stick with you, but the whole point of the show is figure it out, try to see what's going on out there, and see what fits better for you. Mine is the Polynesian Hawaiian systems, like the Hunas. And specifically a system that I've been practicing for now over 6 months, called Ho'oponopono, which is a way of making right again. But not only making right with others, because you can always do that, but making it right with yourself. So a lot of these systems are amazing. We'll sort of also divide the systems as external in their focus and approach, and internal. And obviously, internals are the hardest to grasp, and they're a little bit more difficult, but they're also the ones with the highest rewards. However, and this is one thing I've noticed, it is much harder to work on an internal system when you're younger than it is when you get a little bit older, or at least in the middle of your life. And most of the time, it's a question of maturity, which doesn't mean that you're immature when you're in your 20s, but it just means that you have to do what the heck you need to do in order to get to the point where you finally give up and go, okay, I can't do it by myself anymore. I can't do it alone. I've got to figure it out, and I've got to figure it out with a system that will help me. I was very full of myself, very brash, very pedantic, and I thought I could do it all by myself by taking all the little pieces here and there and creating my own little system, because deep down in my heart, I knew that I had to access divinity or the divine creator or the all. And I thought that if I just took all the pieces together, I would find my own system. Well, that kind of didn't always really work the way it was supposed to. And it got me through some amazing, wonderful highs, but some pretty deep lows. And I reached the bottom of the wave last year where I really had no taste for anything anymore. And that got me to seek out professional help. Believe it or not, I actually sought out a therapist who really helped me, understand that, yeah, all that esoteric stuff is wonderful, but it needs to be balanced. And this is something else we're going to talk about, is that it needs to be balanced with your life right now in society. So it's one thing to go off and meditate for 20 minutes and then you feel all wonderful because you meditated for 20 minutes, or go off on a retreat and say, hey, I went off on a retreat. I went off for 3 days. I went off for 7 days. I went off for 3 months. But let's face it, that's just ego talk. That's just making yourself feel a little bit better. And in my case, all it did was it was repressing this thing inside of me that was saying, hey, something's wrong. I need to understand it. I need to access this anxiety, this deeply rooted anxiety that is motivating me, that is driving me. And it's frustrating because I'm not driving my life. This thing is, this anxiety is. And that's something I wanted to do away with. Well, it turned out that I couldn't get over it until I crashed and I burned. And I pretty much almost lost everything. For one thing, I did lose all of my finances. I almost lost my amazing wife who has been with me for 20 years now. And I almost threw out my whole writing career, my whole journalistic career, which in one sense was good because today I'm doing so much more than just writing about electric cars and electric vehicles and all that good stuff. I'm writing about energy as a whole. I'm involved with a psychological trends. I'm also involved with a more holistic approach to life, ranging from technology to the spiritual to the intellectual to, the feely stuff and all that good stuff. One of the things I also talk about that makes sense in our case are groups of men and groups of women who help us become better integrated inside of ourselves and in society. So, for instance, the Mankind Project will be one of the groups we'll talk about. Womb will be another one for women. And then there are also groups for both that encaptures that very well. Also, another thing that we'll dive into is something that I've always adored. I have always favored lesser known systems, and especially systems that are not very well known. So the reason is that I'm pretty allergic to anything that's too popular, too vulgarized, because it loses its meaning, because there are too many interpretations. And that's one of the reasons why I'll stay away from the mainstream religions. However, I will talk about the esoteric aspects of these religions. So, for instance, I might not really talk about, Protestants and Catholics, but I will talk about Gnostics, and I will talk about the amazing monasteries and priests out in Greece who are actually closer to the original Christianity, much like the Gnostics are. And these guys, guess what? They believe in reincarnations. They believe in meditation. They believe in breathing exercises. Not only do they believe in that, but they actually practice those things. Isn't that amazing? Same thing with Judaism. Not very interested in the modern interpretation of it, but boy, am I more interested in the Kabbalah. And then same thing with Islam. I mean, Islam is it's whatever it is. And these days, I know the media likes to make us think it's a horrible religion. But if you actually read the Quran, it doesn't say to kill anyone. I mean, the interpretations are what they are. But the real point is, I'm more interested in Sufism. Now, that's beautiful because, again, that is the esoteric part of that religion. And as you start to dig into those religions, you sort of go towards the east. And as you go towards the east, you find out in Persia, for instance, modern-day Iran, you find out about the Zoroasters. Fantastic. Again, another offshoot of that amazing repository of philosophies that was put in Egypt, most likely in the Alexandria library that burned, that today we kind of secretly hush-hush kind of way call Hermetics. And now Hermetics is a very strange title given to a bunch of teachings that to this day have no real teachers, no real masters, but are somehow dispersed throughout our society. Now, at higher levels, you do have masters, you do have teachers, but you will never know who they are, most likely, unless you go through years of training and you eventually meet them. You might actually know who they are, you just will not realize that they are. And that's the beautiful part of it. There are people in Egypt right now who still follow the ancient tradition way of Ma'at, and even though it is a Muslim country, but there are still people who follow that. And as we push further out to the east, we get into Pakistan, Afghanistan, where we find some incredible stuff. One of the incredible puzzle as to why are we having wars over there, well, we'll find some of the answers in the fact that these places were the birthplace of some of the greatest philosophies that migrated and went to India mostly, a little bit in China, and then we go to India. Then we discover, wow, Buddhism is fairly new, but before Buddhism, there has always been Hinduism. And Hinduism in and of itself is kind of new too, because before that there were other things, but it sort of morphed into something a little bit more coherent called Hinduism. And based on a holy trinity, it still had influence, especially in the north of India. You had influence from the barbarians coming in and attacking, but they would also leave some amazing precious jewels. So Hinduism is something we'll talk about because it is a very interesting religion that really, I find, is the perfect balance between a philosophy and a religion, in the sense that it is a religion. You believe in God, you pray for God, but it has a lot of philosophical things, something that the West has lost in its religious outlook. As we, of course, look into Hinduism and, of course, further south, Dravidism, we go up north and then we find Tibet. And Tibet is amazing. Tibet is my soft spot. I love Tibet. If you believe in reincarnations, boy, I've lived there a few times. I can still see myself praying with the monks and being with them. I'm just one of them. But Tibet is a very interesting country, and I've certainly learned a lot of things, which is not going to please modern-day China. And I apologize for that. But before Buddhism made it to Tibet, the local religion, which was very close to shamanism, is called Bön. And Bön has been a huge influence on Tibet. And of course, when Buddhism came in, and Buddhism is beautiful because Buddhism gets along with everything. That's the great thing about Buddhism, okay? So you can be a Christian Buddhist, you can be a Jew Buddhist, you can be a Muslim Buddhist, you can be a Bön Buddhist, so on and so forth. And it created a very specific, unique culture, and much of the reason why a lot of the world is up in arms against what China is doing right now in Tibet. China also had some amazing things. I mean, for one thing, Chan, which was the ancestor to the modern-day Zen, the Japanese Zen, and also Taoism. Taoism is a sort of an offshoot also of what Tibet had in Buddhism, in Bön specifically. Another thing we'll talk about in Tibet is Dzogchen. Dzogchen is absolutely amazing. It's one of those precious jewels that have survived to this day. And a lot of these fundamentally old religions, old philosophy systems, old esoteric spiritual systems pretty much always have the same foundation. And that foundation is going to surprise you if you're a Christian or if you're a Jew, but you're perfect. You never really sinned. Your creation was not sinful. The only sinful thing is you kind of forgot. And I forgot, and you forgot, and we forgot. So that is the sin. And sin, in the Latin sense of it, is to be away from. So to be away from remembering that Creator, remembering where you started, remembering who you are. And if we adapted to the Huna system, to be away from being in touch with that subconscious, that unihipili, that has access to the Aumakua, the higher spirit that has access to the divine source. It's beautiful. It's a whole cosmology that fits really well together. And as we move more further out of China, I mean, of course, we have Japan, and I lived in Japan. That's where I met my wife, and then we'll sort of see how Buddhism morphed in Japan and also embraced Shintoism, which is also a sort of shamanistic kind of religion. Now, one thing that you'll find anywhere on this planet is shamanism. And shamanism, we have to be very careful how we look at it, because different interpretations, different societies will look at it differently. Still, the idea is the same. you see beyond the veil of vices, the veil of what we see. You see energies at work, you see entities at work, and you see all kinds of things. One thing we'll also talk about is quantum science, because quantum science has also opened up our very rational and very Western minds to the fact that things are not really what they seem like. For instance, one of the fundamentals about quantum science is that whatever I observe, I influence. And this is one of the biggest problems we've had with quantum computers, is that a 1 is not a 1. A 0 is not a 0. Because if I look at that 1, I will influence it according to my state of mind, and it could be a 1 or a 2, and both at times and whenever. So quantum science is really helping our very down-to-earth, materialistic, empirical in its judgment society to understand that light is energy and matter at the same time. Deal with it. And guess what? Well, the ancient Hindus understood that. The ancient Dzogchenists understood that. The ancient Hunas understood that. All of them already understood that. My God, this was old news for them. So in many ways, what we have done today is we've come a long way. Petroleum has helped us a lot to achieve all kinds of wonderful things. Computers, electricity, so on and so forth. Cars and clothes, colors and things like that. And that has been amazing. But now we have something. We have one of our biggest challenges, and this is going to be more or less my closing thoughts for this introductory. The challenge is very simple. 20 years ago, I read something, and they said, be very careful. Things are about to move exponentially faster. But what this means is that a lot of people will be very disturbed with these changing, or the fast changing pace of everything around you. And some will have very bad reactions to it. One of my shows is called The Lighter Side of Psychosis, where I talk about the strange interactions we have with people, how you say something to someone and it's misunderstood, misinterpreted, and it blows up into something. For instance, I told my neighbors that they couldn't park on our driveway without waiting for us to say yes or no. And you know what? That turned into such a big deal that they no longer talk to us. So just little things like that actually show that this change that's being forced on people, and some of these people who were happy with the status quo, happy living the way they live, work, come home, drink or get stoned, and then, party. A lot of people were happy with that, but that's not what we're about. That's not what we're supposed to do. There's much more to us than just sort of twiddling our thumbs and enjoying a fleeting moment in a passage of life. We have to rekindle our natural divinity inside of us, if you wish, and that can be done in millions of ways. Hence, this is what we'll be doing with the show. So I also look forward to any comments you might have, any ideas, and also any feedback that you might have, any systems that are not that well known. I'm also a Reiki master, but I also practice another system called Kofutu, and that's kind of like almost like Reiki on steroids, if you wish. And a lot of these systems are not always well known for people. And if they are, such as Reiki, a lot of times they're very vulgarized, because I know the original story behind Reiki, and I know the original Reiki, and it has nothing to do with the Reiki that we were taught here mostly in the West, or the Reiki that Ms. Takata in Hawaii introduced to the West. She introduced it, in the 40s, during World War II. It had to have a Christian twist to it. But you know what? Reiki had nothing to do with Christianity. Quite the contrary. So email me if you wish at Nicholas@Car News Cafe. So Nicholas has no H, Nicolas, and Car News Cafe is spelled CarNewsCafe.com. And you can also find me, Nicholas Zart, on tons of social media out there. In the meantime, I look forward to more episodes, and I really look forward to divulging everything that I've known, that I've studied for all these years. I look forward to our interaction, if possible, and I hope, my deepest, sincere hope, is that you find whatever you need to find out there that gets you to communicate with your inner side, your inner self, and your inner divinity, which in turn will open up a whole new world. At 50, I'm finally feeling great about this, and I couldn't go a single day without talking to my inner child. Hope you're having a wonderful day, and I look forward to talking to you next week.